Bye, Bama. LSU's permanent opponents have leaked. We'll tell you what you need to know. Locked on LSU. Here we go.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're free, available wherever you get great podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. As always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. So thank you for that. And I would assume you will have a lot to say about this episode. So on Tuesday, the Southeastern Conference has a TV spectacular plan where they were going to unveil future SEC football opponents. Well, On3 beat them to the punch, leaking the future SEC annual opponents on Monday. Chris Lowe did the honors. But let me rephrase. I don't want to give On3 credit when Chris Lowe, I believe, actually still works. Nope. Okay. Chris Lowe did move to On3. My apologies. Making sure I had that correct. And I know Lowe, of course, formerly of ESPN, now with On3. So Chris Lowe has leaked, or someone leaked to Chris Lowe, the permanent opponents, the annual opponents. And I'm not going to bury the lead. I'll tell you LSU's three, and then I'll give you some reaction to it, not just from LSU, but what else stands out in the rest of the SEC. So LSU's three annual opponents are Texas A&M, Ole Miss, and Arkansas. That means no LSU Alabama, no LSU Florida, no LSU Auburn. This is about as favorable a draw as you could possibly hope for. Now, I, tongue-in-cheek, when they decided they were going to this model, told you I would love to see LSU play Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Mississippi State. Clearly, that was never going to happen. But the point being, I want a path to a championship. You're going to play 9 league games. You're going to play a Power 4 non-conference opponent as well. You're going to be challenged plenty. When you have opportunities to get favorable breaks in the schedule, I want that. Now, the way you look at it like this is not having to play Alabama every year is the big headline here. And you may wonder why that game went away. And there were two schools of thought. Number one was that the LSU-Alabama game for nearly 2 decades has been one of the most valuable properties that the SEC holds. There's just no denying that. For a decade straight, it was the CBS night game when CBS had the schedule, had the SEC contract. But the reality is also that in this 16-team SEC, you're never going to be short valuable television properties. That's just a fact. Like this year, like the last 2 years now, you've had Texas, Georgia. That's massive. You'll have Georgia against Alabama coming up this weekend and for the last 2 years. You're always going to have delicious matchups that are going to be great for television and ratings, no matter how this was all going to play out. The challenge that the league faced was Alabama. I talked about this openly. The single biggest challenge that the league faced was going to be LSU Alabama, because as the league is going out, like, just get a grid, right? And just write on one column the 16 teams and then the 3 across, like, who are the permanent opponents going to be? And you start filling them in. Well, things you know for certain. You knew Alabama was going to play Auburn. You knew Alabama was going to play Tennessee. You know Mississippi State and Ole Miss were going to play each other. You know Texas and Oklahoma were going to play. You know Texas and Texas A&M were going to play. There were certain things that were absolute. Georgia and Auburn were going to play. Georgia and Florida were going to play. There were certain games that undeniably were going to happen. Tennessee, Vanderbilt were going to play. So you start by filling in that grid, and then you fill it in based on, after that, you fill in the rest. Well, the biggest question was going to be Alabama LSU, because it is a long-standing rivalry in the Southeastern Conference. As a matter of fact, when you look at the history of LSU football, the only opponents LSU has played more than are Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and Tulane. LSU's played Bama 87 times. That's the 4th most of any opponent that LSU's played. So that is one of the long-standing traditional rivals in the SEC. It's a very valuable entity and property in the Southeastern Conference. But Alabama most certainly did not want LSU on their schedule every year because they already had Auburn and Tennessee. And if you have Auburn and Tennessee and you add LSU, you would have by a mile the most difficult permanent or annual opponent slate. I don't even think that would be debatable if those were the three. And the way that Greg Sankey explained how they were looking at it several years ago when they first announced they were going to a 16-team league and the possibility of an expanded SEC schedule was you would basically take about a 10-year average of the league and look at the top half and the bottom half. And the top half would play 2 games against the top and 1 against the bottom, and then you'd invert it. The bottom half would play 2 games against the bottom and 1 game against the top. And the way that they explained it was Tennessee had a lot of down years from Derek Dooley and Jeremy Pruitt and some really lean, at the end of Philip Fulmer, some lean years. So well, historically, they're a great program. They'd actually been in the bottom half of the league over that cycle. So LSU, Auburn would be Bama's 2 top-tier opponents, and Tennessee would be the bottom. Alabama clearly didn't like that very much, and the league seldom, if ever, is going to throw Alabama, a rotten tomato in their face. And so the LSU-Alabama game goes away. From an LSU perspective, I love this. Now, listen, I have been front and center crushing Kalen DeBose and doing the Bama is burning and all that sort of stuff. And clearly, I believe that Alabama is not the program now that they were under Nick Saban and never will be that again, not to that level, winning 6 national titles over the course of 12 years. However, they still are a resource, tradition-rich program with a very good roster. And I've said over and over, I do think Kalen DeBoer is a good coach. I don't think he's the right coach for Alabama. I don't think he'll ever win a championship there. But even if they fire Kalen DeBoer in a year or two, whatever the case may be, just hypothetically, there's always the chance that they get it right because Bama's always going to invest the resources into being great at football, like LSU will, like Georgia will. There's always the possibility you could miss, like Florida has missed on coaches outside of Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer. There's been an awful lot of Ron Zook and Jim McElwain. So, there's always those possibilities that Bama could miss. But removing Alabama from your schedule and looking at Texas A&M, which has been a perpetual, the joke is Texas 8-4. Now, although the LSU A&M rivalry since 2018 has become far more balanced than it was when A&M first came to the league, and LSU beat A&M every year from 2012 through 2017. The first 6 years they were in the conference before A&M finally broke through in that 7 overtime game. It has been a more balanced schedule. A&M upset LSU in 2022 when they were a 4-win team and LSU lost in College Station. So there's been more balance in that, but that's still not a top-tier SEC program. Ole Miss has been outstanding under Lane Kiffin. He had the first 11-win season or first 10-win regular season in the history of that program last year. So, or 2 years ago, I should say. So Ole Miss has elevated to a level that they historically are not familiar with, but that's still a program that is a resource, relative to the rest of the SEC, a poverty program. When you look at the SEC and budgets, if you look at annual SEC football budgets, Mississippi State is always going to be, at the bottom, but Ole Miss is, right down there at the bottom as well. When you look at the league as a whole, forgive me, I was trying to pull up directly if I had it there, but Ole Miss again is one at the bottom. So, and then Arkansas, similarly, they're probably going to be going through a coaching change here as well with Sam Pittman on the way out, and that's a team that outside of the Bobby Petrino era in the late aughts and early tens has really struggled ever to find consistency as a member of the Southeastern Conference over the last 30 plus years. So from an LSU perspective, you've got to love this draw. Now, it is also worth noting that the league has said they will reevaluate in 4 to 6 years. So they'll look at these annual opponents over the next 4 to 6 years and evaluate them to see if there's something that has to be altered if you start to see inequity in the scheduling. And truthfully, that's all that I want to see. I want equitable scheduling across the league. Of course, I want a good draw for LSU, which they got. But I just want to see as balanced a schedule. And that's going to rotate. Because, look, some years you're going to draw LSU. Like when we looked at LSU drawing Vanderbilt this year, you'd think, oh, a trip to Vanderbilt, that's a layup. Well, Vanderbilt just scored 70 on Georgia State. They're undefeated. They beat South Carolina on the road. They beat Virginia Tech on the road. That's a tougher game this year against Vanderbilt than we would normally think. LSU drawing Oklahoma their first year in the league. Oklahoma ended up a 500 football team. Well, like historically, Oklahoma's been great. I mean, they won the Big 12 every freaking year. It was just a down year for them where they didn't figure it out at quarterback. Their defense wasn't great. So you're going to see some of those cyclical ebbs and flows, but there's no other way to say it than for LSU not to draw Bama, Florida, Auburn is a huge win for LSU. So Texas A&M, Ole Miss, and Arkansas are LSU's 3 annual opponents. Now, remember, the other 6 opponents are going to rotate on an annual basis. So in 2026, LSU will play Texas A&M, Ole Miss, Arkansas, and 6 other teams in the league. In 2027, they'll play the other 6 teams in the league that they didn't play in 2026. And then in 2028, it'll flip. And then 2029, it'll flip again. So you're home and away. So over a 4-year cycle, you'd play every team in the league home and away. I hope I explained that well enough. Okay, let me do this. Let me knock out my elements here, and I'll come back and I'll give you some reaction from the rest of the league and what I think stands out about these leaked annual opponents. We'll get to that here as we continue. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. Quick question for the college football fans. If you could go back in time, sit in the front row at your school's biggest rivalry game, what hat would you be wearing? Yes, I said hat. For me, it would be the game. See, these aren't just hats. They're the same vintage styles that fans wore back in the 80s and 90s. And guess what? They still go for the same price they did back then. When you use code Locked On College, you'll get your vintage hat for just $16.99. So head to thegamecaps.com. That's thegamecaps.com. Grab your team's classic bar or retro circle design and use code Locked On for an exclusive discount because legends wear the game. We're also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Of course, football season is here. The NFL season is here. And FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to bet. Player props, building a same-game parlay, even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching your team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, easy, and the best way to add a little more energy to your Sundays. So, are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. And finally, today's show is brought to you by Square. There are certain neighborhoods and certain businesses that truly make the neighborhood feel like home. Whether it's the local sports bar packed on game days, the coffee shop that knows your order by heart, or the corner deli that's been serving your community for decades. These are the places that bring people together. When neighborhood businesses thrive, the whole neighborhood thrives. You know, those local spots that make the neighborhood feel like home, so many of them run on Square. Square is a proud partner of more than 4 million neighborhood businesses around the world. You can go to square.com/go/lockedoncollege to learn more. But before you do, go support your favorite neighborhood spot. You'll be happy you did. Square. See you in the neighborhood. Okay, I want to run through some of the other reactions from the rest of the leaked schedule here for the annual opponents for the future of the Southeastern Conference scheduling. It is worth mentioning, though, when you look at LSU in particular and their most common opponents in history, LSU's played Mississippi State 114 times. That's the most of any opponent LSU's had. LSU will not play Mississippi State again in 2026. In theory, I guess they could. It's not one of the annual opponents. I guess they could play in 2026, but it's not one of the annual opponents. Ole Miss is 2 with 108. So the 2 Mississippi schools are who LSU's played the most. Tulane is next with 90, Alabama at 87, Florida at 72, and then Arkansas at 69, Texas A&M 62 times. Then Kentucky, Auburn, Rice, Tennessee, Georgia, Vandy, South Carolina. We start to move on down the list. But, you know, you look at that at that list, LSU will only play one of the top 5 most common opponents in the history of the program, and that's Ole Miss. And then you get to Arkansas 6, Texas A&M 7. So a little bit of an upset there, but it kind of it plays out how they had to do this for competitive balance, and it's a big win, honestly, for LSU. When you look at the rest of the schedule and the rest of the annuals, as you kind of look at what stands out, aside from no LSU Alabama, another big one has got to be no Florida Tennessee and no Oklahoma Texas A&M. Um, um, I think, some of those games that became such valuable parts of the history of the SEC during the divisional era. Florida Tennessee was one of those, and that now won't be played on an annual basis. You look at Oklahoma. I certainly thought that Oklahoma would end up linking with their former Big 12 opponents. I thought Oklahoma would end up playing Texas and Texas A&M, certainly, and probably Arkansas. In the end, Oklahoma draws Texas, which you knew they would, and then they get Ole Miss and Missouri. It's Missouri that actually ended up with the old Big 12 opponents. So Missouri is going to play Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and Arkansas. Big 12 or Big 8, I guess, in the case of Arkansas, or the Southwest Conference, I guess. Sometimes I get confused, the Southwest Conference and the Big 8, who is in what. But anyway, teams that played a long time ago. For example, Oklahoma's most common opponents in the history of their program, Oklahoma State and Texas, 110 times each. Then Kansas, Kansas State, and then Missouri is actually 5th on that list. Texas A&M is 10th. So maybe it does make sense for Oklahoma and Missouri to play more commonly as they will. I think it's also interesting, aside from no Florida, Tennessee, no Oklahoma, Texas A&M, I wanted to look at the contenders to see what did they draw. Well, Alabama, we knew we're going to draw Auburn, Tennessee. They're 3rd, Mississippi State. So they were going to draw someone from the bottom of the league. Let's look at Georgia. Of course, Georgia is now a perennial contender. We knew Georgia was going to play Auburn and Florida. They do. Who is the 3rd? They draw South Carolina. An Eastern Division, SEC East opponent. I certainly think that that's a tougher game than, say, if Georgia had drawn Vanderbilt on an annual basis, but South Carolina has certainly spent their fair share of time in this league in the cellar. Let's look at Texas. Texas draws Texas A&M and OU like we knew they would, and their 3rd opponent is Arkansas. So some historical rivalries there for Texas with A&M, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. But A&M and Oklahoma, 2 of the top tier, Arkansas, a bottom tier team in the league. And then I think you'd have to look at both Oklahoma and Tennessee. Tennessee having made the playoff a year ago, and Oklahoma, was a perennial BCS and college football playoff contender before they moved into the SEC. Tennessee's permanence. They did get Alabama, as we knew. They got Vanderbilt as well. The kicker is that they got Kentucky. So Tennessee, again, like we said, when you look at the rolling average of teams that were going to play, the top half would play 2 against the top, 1 against the bottom, and invert. This is one where, although Tennessee has had recent success over the last 2 decades, they haven't. So they draw Alabama from the top, but Vanderbilt, Kentucky from the bottom. So Tennessee gets a relative breeze. They might actually, although they get Bama, they might be the winner of the entire scheduling format, how all this plays out. And then OU is the other one that I think is worth looking at. Like we talked about, Oklahoma gets Texas, but then they get Ole Miss and Missouri, which have been perennially at the bottom part of the league, but recently here have been very good. Drinkwitz had back-to-back 10-win seasons at Missouri. They're ranked, they're hovering around the top 10 right now. And Ole Miss was, a breath away from a playoff appearance a year ago. So just a few of the takeaways, but the biggest thing for LSU, of course, was the fact that you avoid Bama, you avoid Florida, you avoid Auburn. Now, I love the LSU Auburn game. It's my favorite. I would love to see it play. I know there's a lot of people who love the LSU Florida game, which has been played annually for 50 years now, and that's going to go away on an annual basis. And certainly the LSU Alabama game, since Nick Saban came back into the league, just became this fever pitch ignition switch for the league as a whole. But, I can't help but think that this is a few things. Number one, the old adage is you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. You want to expand, you want to grow revenues, you want to expand your league, you want to be competitive. some of these rivalries are going to go away. It's just the nature of how it has to be, unless if you want to play a dozen league games and make sure that everybody that's a rival plays everybody every year. Until we get to that point, you're going to see things like this happen. But I'll remind you as well, Texas and Texas A&M is one of college football's great rivalries. They didn't play for more than a decade since A&M came into the SEC in 2012. Things like Nebraska, Oklahoma have gone away. Some of college football's great rivalries are just going to fall victim to expansion. And despite that, college football is going to be fine because we're still going to see great games. Like this year, we're going to get Texas, Georgia. You're going to see great games. We're going to see Oklahoma, LSU again this year. You're going to still see great games on an annual basis, and that's really exciting regardless of if some of these rivalries go away. But it's a big step for the SEC. We'll wait and see what the rest of the schedule looks like. So we know, this is important to note, while we know here the annual opponents, what we don't know yet are the other 6 opponents for 2026. And then the other 6 that you don't play will be the 6 you play in 2027. So on Tuesday night, when the SEC does the schedule release show, we won't know the order in which these teams we won't see the schedule and dates in the order in which they play, but we will know the opponents for LSU in 2026. And then by nature there, 2027 and beyond. We'll know that on Tuesday, but what we do know, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, according to On3, will be the 3 annual opponents for LSU, something that will be reevaluated in 4 to 6 years by the league. Okay, there you have it. Drop your comments and let me know what you think about the annual opponent draw that LSU got. That'll do it for us here. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. If you're on podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video. And let a friend know that they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day for Locked on LSU, your team every day.